Now we have a presenter who is a privacy policy manager from Meta. He's going to talk about Meta's open loop. Can you please give a warm welcome to David Lehr?
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I think Jack kicked off this afternoon by commenting on the importance of collaboration, building dialogues in this space. And hopefully what I'm talking about today is a good encapsulation of that approach. So as was mentioned, I am a privacy policy manager at Meta. I've been there for about 3 years, and I'm a lawyer by training, and I spend most of my time thinking about how laws and regulations could approach various data privacy issues. And one of them that I spend a lot of time thinking about is privacy-enhancing technologies or related issues like de-identification and anonymization. And in the process, I've had the opportunity to work with some of my brilliant colleagues on what we call our open loop team. And I'm here to talk about a program that this open loop team ran in Brazil and Uruguay over about 2 years, focusing on pets. So let's get into what Open Loop is as a program. So Open Loop is an experimental governance program. And what we mean by that is it's a program that tries to, in advance, test out new policies, new prototype policies. These might be draft laws, regulations, guidelines, frameworks, and test them on the ground with companies in particular jurisdictions to understand what works about them, what doesn't, all in the service of informing future policy directions. So more particularly, what Open Loop does is it involves co-creating what we call policy prototypes. And we co-create these with a host of folks, with experts in countries, with policymakers in countries, with local tech companies. And then we, as I mentioned, want to test that to figure out what works and what doesn't and translate that into actionable policy recommendations in the form of reports, which I'll get to later. And then in addition to this goal, we also try to build capacity, technical, legal policy capacity with the companies that we are working with on the ground. You'll see in this program that technical capacity was particularly important given the topic we were dealing with. And so you might ask, well, why did we do this program in Brazil and Uruguay? And there are a few reasons for this. One, we saw a lot of policymaker interest in the topic of pets in Brazil and Uruguay, around the world for sure, but in Brazil, for instance, their data protection authority, the ANPD, was interested in this topic and began drafting anonymization and pseudonymization guidance. We also saw a lot of interest among the tech sector in this space. So Brazil has had a very vibrant tech community as well as Uruguay, and we heard from folks on the ground that they were interested in learning more about pets, figuring out what they were, how to deploy them, and they often actually drew a lot of inspiration from uses that they saw in their own countries and in their countries' governments. The city of Rio, for example, has done a lot of work with pets, and that inspired some companies in Brazil to say, hey, could we do the same thing? So with these opportunities identified, what specifically did we do? How did we do this policy prototyping? So the prototype that we co-created was what we called the PETs Playbook. This was a very large document trying to comprehensively lay out for folks what pets are at a basic and a more advanced level, how they might be responsive to different privacy risks or data protection principles, and how you could think about operationalizing them, putting them into practice in the real world. And in particular, one of the proposals of the playbook was this three-step process, a three-step framework for how you might go about thinking about using pets. That involved first assessing what privacy risks might arise in your data processing context, an app that you're working on, and then identifying what kind of risk-reducing strategies might help address those risks. And by strategies, I mean at a very high level, things like, do we want to shield the data? Do we want to change how we compute on data? Things like that. And then finally, identifying which PETs would accomplish those risk-reducing strategies. And with this playbook, we then assembled a consortia of participants across both of these countries. We had 19 companies in total, 16 experts. So these experts were academics, both from technical and legal disciplines. And we had 6 observer institutions, NGOs, DPAs in Brazil itself. And the way we began this process in order to test the policy prototype was we first sat down with the companies in groups with the experts, with the observer institutions, and we did some what we called capacity building sessions. I mentioned capacity building earlier, but we sat down with them first to just say, okay, let's get a baseline of what your understanding of PETs is right now. Do you need a primer on what PETs are and how they operate? What's your understanding of data protection law? Do you have questions about how PETs and data protection law might interact? So we wanted to kind of get that baseline for them and then dive into the testing of the policy prototype, the PETs Playbook itself. So we held a series of workshops. We asked the companies to go off and try to use this PETs Playbook to apply a PET to a data processing context, interviewed them, surveyed them about their experiences, and in the process asked them in particular whether they thought the various steps of the playbook were clear, whether they were effective in achieving what the companies thought they would achieve, and probably most importantly for some of our recommendations that we come to later, were they feasible? Did they have problems trying to implement these PETs, or what challenges did they face? And so those findings coming out of our workshops, of this prototyping, were multiple. And I've put some of the key ones up here. We first found that companies, by and large, had a relatively low familiarity with PETs to start. They might have heard of PETs, they might have heard of things like anonymization techniques, or they might have heard of differential privacy, but they, by and large, did not have much experience actually using them and didn't know much about their details. We did thankfully find that the playbook helped them identify some privacy risks and mitigation strategies, so they did get some education about what PETs are, and they felt more equipped at the end of the program to be able to use PETs. But then, on the other hand, we found that companies had a lot of difficulties with this. They faced a lot of costs and constraints that impaired their ability to implement PETs, not only in this artificial prototyping environment, but especially they were concerned if they were to try to do this at scale. And we tried to dig a little bit deeper and ask, okay, well, what are your concerns? What were the challenges that you faced? Some of them were very brass tacks challenges. They could not afford the data infrastructure or the compute power necessary to implement some PETs. They felt they would have to hire an army of new employees who knew how to use PETs. But then they also expressed concerns over the regulatory, the legal environments that they faced. Many of them said, we get that there are principles in data protection law like data minimization, or we get that there's this concept of anonymization, but we don't really know what that means in practice, or we don't really know how our uses of PETs would be responsive to some of those principles or those legal provisions. And they also said, as a result, I'm a little bit hesitant to jump into these without some of that certainty. Or if I need that certainty, I'll have to spend even more money to hire lawyers to tell me what to do here. So with those findings, we then asked, well, okay, how could new kinds of policies, how could innovative policymaking try to address those challenges that companies were expressing? So obviously one of the sets of recommendations that came out of this was for policymakers to try to provide greater regulatory certainty and incentives for PETs adoption. I just talked about how implementing PETs is often a costly and technically complex endeavor. So many companies, particularly small ones, feel like they need some incentive to do that. And there are many kinds of regulatory incentives that might be provided here. I put just a couple of them on the slide. But one thing that we heard was that companies, as I mentioned, wanted more clarity on this concept of anonymization. How much do you have to reduce the risk of identifiability in your data set for the data to no longer be personal data and thus to no longer be subject to many of the obligations that data protection laws impose. It's not always clear to companies what that threshold is or how their uses of pets to get to that threshold might be assessed. So that was one area of certainty that was desired. Another was kind of more at the start of the data processing life cycle. Can I apply PETs in the first instance, or what do I need to apply PETs to data in the first instance and do so legally? If you're in a legal basis regime, what legal basis can you rely on? Are there certain requirements under data protection laws to use PETs? So clarity about whether you could use PETs in the first instance to reduce risk was also something that could be targeted by new policymaking. And then in addition to providing additional policy incentives, we also heard that companies really were eager for more of the kinds of dialogues that they felt they started to have in this policy prototyping. I mentioned earlier, Jack pointed to the importance of dialogues and multi-stakeholder participation. And I think we saw enthusiasm and eagerness for that among the companies. And we heard that this will be particularly important to involve things like standard-setting bodies, like regulators, like smaller and larger companies. So we saw a lot of eagerness for that. And then finally, and this was perhaps most important for some of the smaller and less resourced companies, we heard a very clear desire for more direct investment in and funding of PETs, including basic research and development. Again, it's one thing if you're a large company like Meta who has resources and engineers to go out and apply some of these PETs. It's a very different thing if you are a small company who has to fight for every dollar that you use. And often these PETs, particularly more complicated ones, take a lot of money and resources to implement. And now, thankfully, we've seen a lot of governments try to go down this route of incentivizing PETs research and development. We've seen the US-UK prize challenges, which are a great example of direct investment and innovation here. We're also seeing greater federal agency interest in it in the United States and how federal agencies can go about incentivizing this research and development. And more of that would always be better. And then finally, and I think this gets to a question that Paul put to Mariana in the last session, we could also see a lot of value for many parties, not just policymakers, not just companies themselves, doing more to educate the average user about what PETs are and how they work. And again, this is where the complexity of PETs, I think, really comes into play here. It's one thing to tell somebody, I took your name, a direct identifier, out of a data set. I think they get what that means technically, and they get the privacy protection that that provides. It's a slightly different thing to say, we used differential privacy to, at a high level, add noise to the data. Maybe they get that technically, maybe they don't, but even then, if they get that technically, it's still not clear what exactly the privacy protection there is to many people. And then the picture gets even more complicated if you start talking about techniques like multi-party computation or homomorphic encryption. So more education, I think, would be extremely helpful here. And again, this is something that many different parties have an important role to play in. So those were some of the key findings and recommendations that came out of these programs in Brazil and Uruguay. And we have memorialized these in a couple of reports that we published on our website, openloop.org, that walk through in more detail the programs, their methodologies, their findings. And we've had a great reception to this so far. The reports were launched officially in July of this year. We did a soft launch in Sao Paulo, and then there was an official hard launch at the CPDP LATAM conference. And we've also had great engagement with this community, with others like this community, on these topics. In May, the OECD held their first in a series of expert workshops on PETs, following up on their great PETs report from last year. And we spoke about Open Loop there. And then I also had the opportunity to participate in a broader PETs discussion at the second expert workshop in July in Singapore. So it's been great to have all of these dialogues, and I'm looking forward to seeing where they go in the future. If you want to read more or learn more about this, check out the reports themselves. They have all of this information in them. And yeah, thank you so much for your time. Awesome. Thank you. Where do you want to sit?
Well, thank you so much for your talk, David. Maybe to introduce myself very quickly, my name is Sharon Ayalde. I'm the Director of Community Engagement at OpenDP. I'm also a former MetaMate. Yes, that's what they were called, MetaMates. I voted for MetaMigo, but that didn't land.
I like that better.
I do too.
Yeah.
Do something. I especially want to ask you questions about the playbook because OpenDP, we're obviously open source, we're housed at Harvard. Education is such a big piece of sharing with the community what differential privacy is, but for pets as a whole, could you maybe talk a little bit more about the experiences that the participants had with the playbook? Were there differences based on where they were from and obviously their background, right?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I think the participants found the playbook pretty helpful. For many of them, this was the first time that they were really reading something comprehensive about pets. That's not to say that doesn't exist. I would point folks to, as I mentioned, the great work that OECD has done in this space, that other international bodies have done in this space. But for many of the participants, this was the first time that they were really diving into this topic. And I think they found the playbook to be a useful primer. We did, though, certainly see some differences in experiences between kinds of participants. We had a mix of participants across the programs. We had smaller companies, medium-sized companies, larger ones. By large, I mean a few thousand-ish employees. And we did see a lot of variation between them in their existing knowledge of pets and then what they did with the playbook. Particularly, we saw that in Brazil, most of the companies, be they medium or large, had some initial familiarity with pets, not saying they knew all of the details or how to implement them, but they had a kind of baseline level of familiarity. We didn't see as much of that in Uruguay. And then, I think this was true for both Uruguay and Brazil, we saw that, as you would probably expect, the larger companies had more experience and felt more confident in using pets than the smaller ones did. Some of them had actually already used some kinds of pets, like removing direct or indirect identifiers. Some of them had used differential privacy in the past, but we saw much less familiarity with the smaller companies. And to your point about open sourcing, I think that is a key topic to raise here because especially for those smaller companies, they're going to have to rely on open sourced solutions. So the more that there are open solutions out there, the better. I'll talk a little bit tomorrow in a panel about some of the open sourcing that Meta has done on this front, but yeah, absolutely a great point.
Maybe actually just taking a step back, why did OpenLoop start looking into the pet space? Was it a timing thing? Was there some point that something happened in Brazil or Uruguay that was your first region? You know, where did this all start?
Yeah, so part of it was we identified that there was some regulator interest in this topic. We saw that Brazil's AMPD was going to be doing some work in this space. But honestly, the impetus of it was we got asked to do it by folks we knew in Brazil and Uruguay. They said, we know this program, this OpenLoop program exists. The OpenLoop program had been doing work primarily in the AI space up until the point when it started, which I should have mentioned was at the end of 2022. So we heard from folks, we would love to have an OpenLoop in these countries, and what we are interested in is pets. I think that period a few years ago was when there started to be a lot more interest in pets in the policy space. People started hearing about it more. There was more talk of it at data protection conferences, and then that percolated through to a demand for these programs. So yeah, it was a really organic way that it all started.
Sometimes it's the best way of starting anything. You get everyone on board, there's interest, obviously bias, we like the pets topic, right? So now that the reports are out there, those programs have been completed, How do you see their findings being used for policymaking, for example? Has anything happened since? Catch us up.
Yeah, so many things are happening here. As I mentioned, I think I would love to see the results of the report provide some inspiration to policymakers when they're doing things like drafting anonymization guidance or putting out primers on how you could use pets in data protection contexts. And I think we've already seen a ton of great work being done on that front. The ICO has done and is doing great work on that front. Singapore's DPA as well has been involved in this. I think very recently we got some criteria on anonymization from Thailand's DPA. So there is a lot of interest in this space, and I think it's a prime time for hopefully the results of the report to be informative. To get a little bit more specific and build a little bit more off of what I talked about, I think greater clarity around anonymization would be really helpful. We've seen over the past few years a divide kind of emerge in terms of how people think about anonymization, or what you might call de-identification or dissociation if you're in certain jurisdictions that use different legal terms of art. You have some folks who take a more absolutist approach to say, in order to anonymize data, you have to make it absolutely impossible to re-identify anybody in the data set. And I think what we're seeing is that there's a greater recognition that that is impossible in practice, that there's always going to be some residual, some negligible risk of re-identification, but also that it's not necessarily desirable or the most effective privacy protection in practice. So that has led to, I think, some other folks saying, okay, maybe we need to take a slightly different approach to what this means. We still think anonymization needs to be a high bar. It still needs to be a strong privacy protection. But we're not going to pretend that the risk has to be absolutely zero. Instead, we're going to say, your risk needs to be sufficiently low, sufficiently negligible. Naturally, that begs the question then, well, what is sufficiently low, or how do you measure it? And I think that's where a lot of the work to be done lies right now. I think we've seen some recognition that measuring that level of risk should be a contextual process. You should ask, okay, not just did I apply a pet to the data or did I remove identifiers, but what non-technical measures exist? Are there legal contracts in place that say I'm going to share this data with somebody, but they are legally prohibited from trying to re-identify it? Are there access controls so that only certain employees in an organization can get access to certain data? So I think it's important to have that contextual approach. That, though, then does beg yet another question. Well, okay, how should a company know with this maybe wishy-washy contextual test whether a regulator would agree with them?
Right.
If they say, I'm applying pets to this data set, I'm trying to anonymize it, I think I've reduced the risk a lot to where it's really, really low, taking into account all of the context of the data processing, would a regulator agree with me?
Right.
And I think this is another key topic to be addressed going forward. I think there's a lot of room for policy innovation here. I think there's a lot of room for things like sandboxes, which both the ICO and the Singapore PDBC have availed themselves of. I think there's room for more informal processes of soliciting input from regulators rather than waiting on an enforcement action or waiting on the hammer to come down. Could you go to a regulator and say, hey, here's what I'm thinking of doing. Can you give me your initial thoughts on whether this meets what you think is the bar of anonymization? I think that would be very helpful. So that was a lot, but hopefully good start.
There was so much there. I mean, to be honest, you and I even spoke about this just moments ago, opening up the conversation, having a conversation, having just different perspectives and opinions. It's okay if you don't agree with me, but let's work together to find a solution. And that is key in not just partnerships and engagements and collaboration, but just being open and more transparent of, I haven't solved this yet, and I really want help. It's okay to ask for help. And that's what you lean on the community for. That's what you lean on experts for, and that's why you do partnerships, just as a whole.
Exactly, and I will say, this is something I believe I said back in Singapore in July. I think we recognize that this is a really tough area for regulators and policymakers too. I mean, this is not an easy topic to get your hands around. It's difficult, maybe impossible, to write regulatory guidance that says in a prescriptive way, here's how you can have confidence in whether I, regulator, will agree that you have anonymized your data. That's tough. So I think we completely empathize with the spot that regulators are in there. But that's why, as I mentioned, I think there's a lot of room for interesting new ways of policymaking here, like sandboxes, like advice lines, things like that.
So my last question.
Yep.
Could you share just with this audience and the community how they can get involved with Open Loop? Are they always going to be structured like they were for Brazil and Uruguay? Alternative ways of participating? How do we get our hands on that playbook?
Absolutely. So go to openloop.org. You can contact us through there. There's more information about our programs there. Historically, most of the work that Open Loop has done has been in the kind of format that I described here, really in-depth co-creation of policy prototypes, working over the period of months or years to test them. But we recognize that that's not always the best way to address issues or the one that's always the most responsive to participating companies' needs. So we are starting to explore new kinds of programs like shorter workshops or sprints. So there are many opportunities to get involved, and go to our website if you'd like to find out more.
Amazing.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.